Started? Yeah, that's actually a lot better. Yeah, thanks.
You started the webinar, okay, that's go, audio looks good, and everything's good.
Yep.
All right, just make sure when you share the screen, have your stuff ready to rock.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Thanks very much. Hi, everybody. We are getting started in just a second here. Before we get started, I want to introduce CLAGS to you. I am Matt Brim. I'm the Executive Director of CLAGS, the Center for LGBTQ Studies, proudly housed at the CUNY Graduate Center. CLAGS is the first academic research center of its kind, university-based, for the study of LGBTQ people and ideas and histories and theories. And at CLAGS, we have a big mission, but we can boil it down to this. CLAGS is here to provide free and accessible LGBTQ studies to everyone, because everyone deserves free, accessible LGBTQ studies. We welcome everybody here in the audience today and everyone watching the live stream at home. This video or this event will be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel. And so if you want to show it to your classes or your friends or colleagues, it will be available for you later. I want to make you aware of an opportunity. Today I'll be introducing Christina Chica, who is the CLAGS Scholar in Residence for 23-24. And I want to make you aware of the Scholar in Residence opportunity. If you go to CLAGS webpage, clags.org, you will see a drop-down menu for fellowships, and you'll see the Scholar in Residence Fellowship there. To be considered for Scholar in Residence Fellowship for the fall of 2024, we need to have your application in by June 1st. And to be considered for the spring of 2025, we need your application in by October 1st. I really encourage people to look at the application and requirements. What we provide shared office space and access to the Graduate Center's library and databases, as well as the very lively intellectual communities that we have here. In order to help emerging scholars enter the field and to shine spotlights on them and to boost their work, we need your help. One of our missions, as I said, is to provide free and accessible programming. One way we do that is through donations from people who attend our events and consider our mission valuable and share that mission. And so I want to encourage you to give just a little bit, maybe more than a little bit if you can. Go to clags.org. It really does help us to support emerging scholars, not only through the Scholar in Residence program, but through a number of student fellowships that we offer for graduate student and undergraduate papers, as well as other events that feature emerging scholars like Christina, who is finishing up their dissertation at UCLA right now. Again, you can go to clags.org and hit the donate button, and that will take you to our giving page. We can't thank you enough for helping us, for sharing our values about free public education for LGBTQ ideas, and for being here today for the people in the audience, and for being great virtual audience members at home. It's my privilege now to introduce the 2023-24 Scholar in Residence at CLAGS, Christina Chica. Christina is a doctoral candidate in sociology at UCLA, and as well as a Scholar in Residence at CLAGS, Christina is a visiting research scholar at the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics here at the GC. They are the child of migrants from Mexico and El Salvador, and an interdisciplinary sociologist with research and teaching interests that span a broad array of topics. Christina has used multiple methods to study placemaking among LGBTQ+, migrant, and racially marginalized populations across time and space. Hi, welcome. Her current project investigates the relationship between urban change and LGBT plus placemaking in Mexico City, with particular emphasis on how LGBT plus people and organizations have adapted to COVID-19. And there's sort of an interesting story of how Christina's research changed in the pandemic. More broadly, Christina is interested in the process of forming beloved community and its potential for grounding social relations rooted in wellness and social justice. And you can learn more about Christina and their work by going to their website, ChristinaChica.com. Christina, it's been wonderful getting to know you this year at CLAGS. Christina and I sometimes sit at desks that are across from each other and have had the chance to get to know each other a bit and have fun and interesting conversations, as well as, I have to say, as just provide support to each other. And it's been really valuable for me and for CLAGS as an organization. It's my privilege to welcome Christina Chica, the CLAGS Scholar in Residence, to talk about placemaking in Mexico City.
Cool. Yeah. So I guess we're gonna wait a moment for this to come up. Awesome. All right. You know, it's fine. I mean, as long as people can see what's going on in the middle of the slides and I have my script. Yeah,
I
thanks.
want to make sure that that ASL is shown. I have to make it that big.
No, that's okay. Yeah,
Great.
that's cool. Thank you so much. All right, can everyone hear me all right? Yes, awesome. So hi, everyone. Again, my name is Christina Chica. I use she, her, and they, them pronouns, and I'm an extended visitor, as was already said, from the Department of Sociology at UCLA. Matt did a great job with introducing me and where I'm located right now at the GC, so I'm not going to repeat that. But before I start, I would like to thank Matt Brim, the CLAGS director, Donna Huaman, who facilitated my communication with the ASL interpreters. I'd also like to thank everyone else at CLAGS who made it possible for me to be here and speak with you all. And I want to say welcome. Welcome to my presentation on my current project, which is called Queer Metropolis, LGBT plus Placemaking in Mexico City, and specifically a slice of it that I'm going to talk about, which specifically is called Creation After Disaster. So I'm going to start with a short version of this project's origin story. Then I'm going to move into an example of built environmental change, give an overview of Queer Metropolis, along with one of my primary conceptual contributions. Then I'm going to get into the meat of observations with a focus on one chapter in particular of my dissertation, which is called Creation After Disaster. All right. So I started going to Mexico City to connect with LGBT plus scholars and activists and to visit the places queer people shaped for themselves in 2018. Back then, I was getting to know the field and evaluating how the city would receive me to see if I could viably conduct dissertation research and contribute something hopefully meaningful. After receiving positive feedback from civil society leaders, activists, and queer scholars, I decided to return in 2019 to do more preliminary work and set everything up to return to spend all of 2020 in Mexico City. So with my dissertation proposal defended and my Mexican passport in hand, thanks to the work of my mother and her efforts at the Mexican consulate in Los Angeles, I set off at the beginning of January 2020 to Mexico City. I get myself situated.
It's me.
Okay, I get myself situated and set up, then start making rounds through various field sites as well as scheduling appointments. I attend an impactful demonstration during International Women's Day that would reverberate throughout the city over the next couple of years, the effects of which I touch on later in this presentation. Then, as you all know, COVID hits and everything changes. As a result, my project changes and I along with it. So what happened? Well, I didn't end up staying until the end of 2020, but I did stay until July and experienced the early months of this global pandemic in Mexico. In the process, and with generous support, I designed and added a survey component to my project. Apart from shifting to non-physical contact research, I chose to do this because I wanted to know what was going on with the LGBT plus population in Mexico City that I was now a part of, and which had been largely ignored in early survey efforts to assess COVID-19 impact. Waiting to stick with people as they adapted to disaster led to my adaptation, including methodologically, not only incorporating this new survey, but also virtual ethnography and social media content analysis. My project grew multifaceted, more urgent, and facilitated additional questions that dovetailed with my original ones. But I never lost the commitment to embodied reality in physical space. And so I went back to Mexico City for the summer of 2021 to bear witness. Change was palpable. I could literally touch it in the built environment. I saw some of this start to unfold in 2020, but it was on a different level when I returned. What was particularly striking was this visual element to the street politics that had emerged over the pandemic, especially with roots in the feminist protests over the last couple of years in the city. So what do I mean by visual element? Well, what I see is political graffiti and art all over monuments, like the Ángel de Independencia, located in the business center of the city, various government buildings in the historic center near the Zócalo and Palacio de Bellas Artes, under bridges and on statues throughout, such as at the Sereno at the center of the Glorieta de los Insurgentes. So we went from this environment at the metro station and vehicle roundabout known as the Glorieta de los Insurgentes, the metro stop nearest the historically gay and queer Zona Rosa, which is across the street from the US Embassy, by the way, to this. The Glorieta was more disheveled than the last time I visited a year prior, with what seemed to be half of the semi-permanent businesses and their walls gone. In their place, a bunch of mostly young people sat on the floor with large spreads on top of carpets, tarps, and sheets, selling clothes and knickknacks. They were all under the circular roundabout where cars were passing, beneath which is the metro station. So for example, to give you a sense of the imagery, I noticed a young rocker decked out in black, messing with his amp, and playing a few chords of Tears for Fears' Everybody Wants to Rule the World. There were a lot of younger people that looked like him, a mix of rockers and goths hanging out next to the vendors. Some were trying to sell things, some were just clearly queer and trans or gender-bending friends of these sellers hanging out. And quite a bit of the beautiful public seating that had been there was no longer there. I recall some attractive benches, but most of what remained in that moment was the concrete. I discuss later what I come to learn about what I'm describing is this politically inflected swap meet organized by gender and sexual dissidents. For now, what is particularly striking about the Glorieta is the newly present graffiti, some of which is artistically rich, some of which is what we would understand as standard tagging. Except this tagging is not the opaque territorial marking that I am used to in the US, or that I have been used to in the US prior to more recent phenomenon and protest movements, but rather clear, if sometimes misspelled, political stance taking about a variety of issues and social locations. I infer that most of these visual markings were made by queer and trans people, especially feminists fighting for the government to take violence against women in Mexico seriously. There's also queer political art and graffiti that reflects intersectional feminism. When we look closer, we see that this political graffiti points specifically to transnational ideas about dismantling white supremacy, promoting trans-inclusive feminism, abolishing the police, and more. These taggers use local terms like lencha and marica to self-name as gender and sexual dissidents, in contrast to conventional globalized terms like gay and lesbian. Apparently, the city attempted to clean up the area, particularly the graffiti, but these taggers just kept coming back, and so the city temporarily gave up for a while. And so I'm just gonna read a couple of these things right here to give a sense of that. So over here on the left-hand side, we have FIFA que veo, FIFA que pateo, right? FIFA being the International Football Association, and we're seeing them, we're gonna kick you. Underneath siempre marica, nunca cobarde, right? Or like always marica, which is a local term, right? For I guess you could say queer men considered more feminine, and never a coward being something that's been used to describe, right, queer people, especially queer men, and any sort of presentation of femininity, historically speaking. And then you have muerte la police, right? Or death to the police, y al feminismo blanco, right? And to white feminism. And you'll notice that blanco is not spelled with the usual BLANCO, but with triple Ks, which is, you know, KKK. These are these transnational ideas that are being seen. Beneath that, lesbiana y tu hermana, right? Or lesbian and your sister. And then on the other side, you have la revolución será transfeminista o no será, or the revolution will be trans feminist or it won't be. And these are just a couple of the examples, particularly in the Glorieta, but there were examples of this type of graffiti around this time in various parts. And in fact, these messages are part of a geography of interventions in various places in the city that are highly visible. For example, the left hand side, right, the installed monument near the Palacio de Bellas Artes says, "We demand a national gender alert." A place with lots of foot traffic, which again, the Plaza de Bellas Artes is the, how do you even say that in English? The art, the main sort of art center, right, towards the center of the city, as well as less visible interventions, right? Like this flyer of Audre Lorde's famous translated quote about how silence did not save her and would not save us either. And like the graffiti we saw before, much of this art is by and about gender and sexual dissidents, connecting their struggles to anti-colonial and anti-capitalist ideas, or simply to the reality of being marginal, especially economically, increasingly with pandemic-related hits and consequences during this time. But for now, I'm going to zoom out because these pictures are part of a larger ecosystem of LGBT plus placemaking in Mexico City. Today, I'm going to talk about how groups make and sustain community and place. That is how they placemake, which I talk about more or less as the process of people creating, maintaining, and giving sense to space while differently accessing and contesting spatial function, location, meaning, and resources. Now, this is a brief overview of my substantive dissertation chapters with shortened chapter titles. And as I mentioned previously, the talk today will be pulling mostly from chapter 5, which uses oral history interviews and in-person ethnographic observations from July and August, mostly July and August of 2021, to examine the adaptive strategies in LGBT plus placemaking to a quote-unquote new normal or transitional pandemic period. And for the sake of time, I'll be focusing on my participant observations, so a lot of the ethnographic work, right, as opposed to some of the oral histories that I've conducted with various people involved with these projects. But before I get into that, I want to provide larger context for this project, where I investigate the relationship between urban change and LGBT plus placemaking in Mexico City over time by starting with these research questions. Primarily, I ask, how do the environmental, economic, and sociopolitical consequences of disaster shape LGBT plus place projects in this global city? What insight can gender and sexual minority placemaking in Mexico City provide to an increasingly global comparative sociology, which is something that I'm hoping we're moving towards and that I actually talk about in terms of promoting an increasingly global comparative sociology, and to the study of space, place, and placemaking more broadly? And then finally, how do LGBT plus people queer Mexico City's dominant cartographies, or rather ways we map and claim space, as they generate their own geographies of the city as it changes? And what I want everyone to take away from this talk today is that these varied examples from my summer field work are expressions of one of the key contributions that my dissertation to book project makes, which is to discuss a relational theory of social action through placemaking that I call creative destiny. This is a fundamental mechanism of placemaking that I'm increasingly conceptualizing, again, as this theory of action through placemaking that is the process of people called by their specific spatial, temporal, and embodied relationships to respond to dynamic needs by creating material and symbolic places. Creative destiny is a relational process in that actors are called to react in relation to specific time, place, and other bodies. To break it down a bit more, creative refers to creating places, businesses, visions, networks, workshops, and other tangible material or symbolic products through these relationships. Destiny encapsulates the observation that much of this placemaking does not result from actors' pre-established goals, but neither from inevitable pathways laid before them. Rather, people are collectively shaping their destiny through responsive choices to dynamic needs, of which COVID-19 as a disaster provides a great opportunity to examine more deeply. And to be clear, my use of destiny is not synonymous with fate. In choosing the word destiny, I evoke a notion of chance as redirected, unexpected possibility. We cannot deny the role of chance in everyday action and in social action. To do so would be to ignore that innovation comes from making decisions in the face of constraints. Our limitations are precisely the reason for our creativity, in that we always work within the realm of the possible to push against it and expand it. And this was happening before COVID-19, but COVID-19 was a catalyst for adaptation, right? Where there basically was no choice but to change a lot of things. And so I'm gonna briefly put up this visual model, which is a little bit hard to see right now, but I'll talk about it. And it's to place the concept into larger conversation that I'll touch on more later in this presentation. And so I'm going to come back to this. It's just an idea of thinking about placemaking overall and how I'm imagining it with other concepts like linked fate in the service, right, or the goal of moving closer to beloved community. And so I'm just putting it as like a first exposure, but I'm going to come back to it later on. All right. So first things first, how do I get here and who am I in conversation with? The next few slides are going to give part of a broad overview. I will also say, though, that as I've been here visiting at the Graduate Center, there's been a lot of influences that have yet to make it to the larger project that I'm really excited to read more and incorporate more of, both through CLAGS, but also through the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics. And so what I'm sharing with you right now are some of the initial and through the process folks and pieces of literature that were really important to conceptualizing the project and some of what I've done, but with this sort of open question mark, of course, of different influences that I'm increasingly looking towards and in conversation with, especially as I think about revisions toward the book project. All right, cool. So earlier I gave my definition for placemaking, but I'm going to zoom in on a couple of ideas that come from critical geography. So I think about place as a spatial temporal event. In other words, something that is happening whether in the short term or the long term in specific time and space. By extension then, placemaking is a spatial temporal process. And this process is not just about making something in a physical environment, but also in the symbolic field of ideas and feelings, which also make up culture and happens when we think about, right, mental cartography or map making, where we connect physical places with the way that people dress, act, think, speak, or otherwise meaning make. And while my project pulls from critical geography as well as gender and sexuality studies, right, different social science on disaster, there is particularly a sociological literature around place and space and increasingly placemaking. Some might use the term outright, others describe these processes without using it, though I'm noticing, especially with doctoral students and people who are coming up, it's becoming more of a term that people are using in sociology. And so the American sociological literature that I'm pulling from discusses things, for example, like Black placemaking, being forwarded through a specifically assets-based framework premised on the idea of linked fate, or this idea of group consciousness that leads to more political cohesion, if not necessarily as much social cohesion. And of course, that's arguable and debatable how that works, right? But the point of that is that we see people coming together based on the networks that they are born into and their social position of marginalization. And so because of shared Blackness, because of linked fate, folks come together to create place, joy, and more in these sort of asset-based theories of Black placemaking. And this is outlined more fully in the Theory, Culture, and Society article, Black Placemaking, Celebration, Play, and Poetry, which I, encourage people to look up and expanded upon some more in a book called Chocolate Cities, right, by Marcus Anthony Hunter and Zandria Robinson. But there's also another side to that, which is where my contribution comes in theoretically in terms of one of the entry points, which is a form of placemaking that I'm calling creative destiny, which is about how, despite the differences, we come together. It is not about the networks we choose, right, for the sake of just survival or resistance, not even just in terms of thriving, but also in terms of thinking about possibilities or rehearsals in the service or the long march towards what one could call emancipatory future, which I'm deciding to use the language of beloved community. All right. And beyond Black placemaking, we learn how place shapes identity, specifically queer identities that might cross space but are expressed particularly due to people being embedded in specific places and moving into the wheel of placemaking that has already begun there. And so, for example, Japonica Brown Sorrentino's How Places Make Us is one of those pieces, one of those works. And then, this is also something that's true of migrants in the US constantly, right? Arriving in a new place, making their mark on space and place, trying to make that through different expressions of joy and culture and other types of things. And then the way that that is influenced, we can also see abroad, right? Through other examples of global comparative placemaking, which is where The Rise and Fall of an Urban Sexual Community by Dana Collins comes into play. And within all of these sorts of expressions, particularly in terms of migrants, right, sometimes with queer people, but also abroad and internationally, and in these sorts of places that are constantly being influenced, right, by larger global forces of displacement, of neoliberal policies, et cetera, we see, right, how placemakers juggle precarious mobility, global economic change, and slippery social positions. All of which I argue to bring together in my Sociology Compass article, Toward a Sociology of Global Comparative Placemaking, to encourage sociologists to integrate multiple theoretical, methodological, and epistemological insights for a globally informed comparative placemaking sociology. And essentially, that's just revealing my interdisciplinary, flavor and commitments, and trying to remember that we're producing all of this scholarship, we're creating different terms, right, in these parallel realities across disciplines, and it's often a good idea to read each other, right? So, and to show where we have those points of confluence. All right, cool. And so just to talk a little bit about methodological approaches, right? I incorporate feminist insight on intersectionality and standpoint, just as a matter of course of like existing in my body in the world, right? But I'm going to say it right now, as well as thinking about how specific bodies in space and in interaction with other bodies, spaces, and institutions happen. And much of which has been taken up through diverse methods in recent work on queer and or queering of sociological and interdisciplinary methods. And so I don't have too much time to talk about some of this work, right? But I'm happy to talk more about it in the Q&A if there's interest. All right, so by way of coming back to the substantive part of this talk and my final substantive chapter, it's within this larger methodological consideration that I do research, right? And since this chapter specifically builds on oral history interviews as well as participant observation, I put a couple of works out here from people who are influential to me, right? Juan Herrera and Carita Brown are people who are advisors of mine. Boys Town does a really great job of thinking about in-place sexual expression and doing some theorizing around that, right? In terms of the charm circle, in terms of sexy community, which is a concept I think is really useful, which I can talk about more later. And also this like idea of, that other people have talked about, which is like being on safari, right? So people coming into queer spaces and for various reasons and how they fundamentally are shifting them, right? If they don't pertain to those communities and identities. And then tortilleras, negotiating intimacy, is a work that really takes a lot of these affective or emotional relationships and loving relationships, especially alternative ways of relating among women, right? Mostly cis, but also trans, right? In Mexico City. And it was a really cool read and something that forms some of the historical foundation and some of the sort of relational ideas that I think through. All right. So, yeah. I think the only other thing to say about this is while the oral history interviews won't be present today, I do use them for their multi-pronged use, right? So in certain ways, their social and community history, especially in terms of cartographic memory, right? Because we know that memory is really slippery. It's hard to sort of think about that in terms of historical construction. There's been a lot written about how talking to people after the fact and versus like the beginning of an event happening, right, can yield a lot of different explication. But I still think it's important to keep that as part of a community memory and history, and especially the way that folks can think about places that don't exist anymore, because a lot of queer place can be ephemeral, right? And so I think about it in terms of that, but as well as experiences of the pandemic. And yeah, so as I said before, the rest of the talk is going to focus on the participant observation, a portion that I conducted during the summer of 2021. All right, cool. So come back with me, take a deep breath, and I'm going to invite you to travel back to Mexico City during the summer of 2021. And so what happens? I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see when I get there, right? And I noticed that Mexico City authorities prioritize certain business operations over others, and its selective shutdowns and stay-at-home orders from the beginning. The state placed leisure sites at the bottom of their priority list, especially nightlife spaces like bars and clubs, which we know are often key in gender and sexual minority placemaking. While restaurants and cafes reopened at uneven rates, by the time I returned, in June of 2021, many establishments that figured out how to survive the previous year through different adaptations, which I'll touch on, were there, and they were open. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And so gay and queer establishments adapted to stratified economic survival by quickly morphing into restaurant or cafe mode. That is, rebranding and shifting operations to function more like restaurants or cafes by serving food, changing hours of operation, bringing in tables into their spaces, enforcing distance protocols, and shifting the interactional logic and flow with each other and with physical space. This was true, for example, of places like Rico's in the Zona Rosa and El Pecado on the street República de Cuba, located in the historic downtown. Meanwhile, I visited, quote unquote, straight spaces, such as an enclosed karaoke bar located on Genova Street in the Zona Rosa, where people were drinking maskless and dancing around tables without any care or attention to social distancing, playing loud music, well past the city mandated closing time of midnight without issue. And this is like a stone's throw from Calle Amberes, which is often understood as one of these key places for bars and clubs, right, in Mexico City. And so they're just doing their thing and everything's whatever. And so it is an example of some of the selective, right, operations. And it matters because it comes right after a massive raid had occurred on July 8th, just after 9 p.m., where city workers and police arrived to close various establishments on what I mentioned before was Amberes Street, pasting big white signs on gates and doors with the words "suspension of activities" in red written on them. Now, those establishments remained closed throughout the summer, and it was actually lucky and serendipitous, right, that I happened to be there and arrive at that night at the moment that this was going on, right? And was able to sort of talk to people on the street and, see these pasted signs coming on with the white vans and the city workers and be like, whoa, okay, great. I guess I'm not hanging out here this summer. So that's what was going on. However, it matters to talk about it because those establishments, while they remain closed, right, they weren't necessarily different in terms of following COVID protocol, right, as the previous example that I shared. What's also interesting, though, is that a handful of friends and casual, informants, participants across gender, class, and skin tone express what appeared to be an open secret of selective operations on the part of gay or queer nightlife venues. That is, the group of bars and clubs under the same ownership and or management would either strategically operate one establishment, usually the one that makes the most money, right, in a general area, or come to some type of agreement with authorities, right, that one could be open if other ones would close, right? And so there were ways that people were navigating this. Of course, that was not open to everyone. And there were other strategies that some establishments or reoccurring parties used, like throwing clandestine parties in someone's apartment or booking bars and clubs that had been set up or converted into speakeasies when that spatial formation came back into style, right? And so what's interesting is that this pre-existing infrastructure, right, this sort of speakeasy-esque type of places, fortuitously served the original purpose, right, that speakeasies were historically built for once the pandemic came around and patrons actually needed to evade the authorities in order to gather, drink, and party. And I remember one such bar in the Roma neighborhood that had a few people drinking while seated, which was permitted because the space was not completely enclosed. It was pretty open. And so there could be, passing flow of air. And it would not have drawn much attention, even though it was brightly painted and stylishly decorated. However, once you came in and made it through a back door, there were two sizable and completely enclosed club rooms where the real party was happening. And I should say really quickly, right? When I got there, they were putting little smiley stickies on our cameras, on our phones, that were super hard to take off, right? And so there was very much the structural logistical investment in keeping those things secret, right? Or somewhat secret, and not like taking pictures or documenting all of that. Yeah. And so in that way, resistance can be read in complicated ways. On the one hand, this involves blindly dismissing health protocols and social responsibility by throwing clandestine parties. But on the other, these parties were key for queer people to make money, right, and economically survive, as well as to attend to different mental health considerations of just, convivencia, right, coming together through fun and through joy. For some, these efforts are an adaptation to continue to support projects and nightlife establishments that had taken a hit during the pandemic and were in danger of closing for good. In fact, towing the line or clandestinely going against city protocols helped to weather the storm to open back up the legitimate businesses, right, later on in that year. And I'm just going to give one example of this. When we get inside, we see some of the braided material and symbolic placemaking that I mentioned before, like this party creating place with music and art that is unapologetically sexual, queer, and transnational in their reference points, like an explicit Popeye, and by explicit I mean that he has his dick out, but you can't really see, so I'm sorry. And the fabulous Ursula over pictures of the infamous drag queen of filth and John Waters' muse, Divine. So when you think about how the colonial project has been to extinguish homosexuality, and especially in its feminine expressions, then the explicit gesturing, not just an action, but also an aesthetic, to the independent, fat, and divine sexual, seems to gesture to a certain types of dissidence and anti-colonialism that is sometimes complicated and conflictingly read when you think about this party being something that you went into to help and survive a business, right? And let me tell you, those drinks were not cheap. They charged me 50 pesos for sparkling water, and I only got sparkling because they didn't have actual water. So, goes to show you. But I still think it's worth mentioning what's going on here and the ways that the symbolic and artistic gestures, right, are pointing to these larger reference points, and these larger reference points specifically of joteria, which some people translate as camp. I don't think that that's the best translation for it, but it more or less does the job for now. Yeah, so, and, I'm not letting people off the hook, right? At the end of the day, I'm down in the ground and I do empirical work with my body in space. So at the same time, my interactions with men in this space and those of my two companions pointed to a sexuality and permitted femininity where multiple sexualities and gender expressions coexisted comfortably, but when shared around a mutual phallic desire. That is, if you were a straight or bi man or woman or penis-desiring trans person, you would be among what Jason Orn calls, and I mentioned earlier, a sexy community. Lesbians are primarily women-centered desiring people that to center the penis would not feel as comfortable there, nor would a woman, queer or straight or otherwise, put off by a man's direct and unyielding desire. So I would be remiss not to mention how normalized forceful desire and lack of consent is also perpetuated by women who grow up in it. And it was something that I would experience here and there throughout my field work over the years. And I don't have to get into it, I mean, unless you want to talk to me or ask me about it in the Q&A, but this is the sort of general landscape in which these different contradictions and, conflicting kinds of values are seen. And unfortunately, some places were not just in danger of being lost, but have already been lost. A feminist place that served as a refuge for women, especially lesbians, and fed our bodies and souls through vegetarian food, pulque, music, dance, and other cultural events folded under the pandemic. And where it stands, just months later, is a Peruvian chicken spot next to an Asian market. When I visited to assess the damage, I noticed a nearby park with a relatively freshly installed playground and some outdoor workout equipment. There were families present in the large plaza, a far cry from the small metal puestos where street vendors sold goods and food and then locked up by nightfall that used to be in the foreground of this picture. That area with rows of them was fairly an empty space at that point. Now, there's much that can be said about the role that Punto Gozadera played in gentrifying a plaza that then ungratefully pushed them out. But for now, suffice to say that the previous owners of the place, Libertad en Pacha and their comrades, were not sufficiently resourced to keep the vital place operating. And a footnote to this is that the project in its sort of digital and then eventually physical formation did pop up in a different place, right, with some time, but it was more at the periphery of the city and in a much smaller space as opposed to a more centrally located neighborhood in these sort of areas that are experiencing a lot of gentrification. Yeah. Yet some places remained, like a lesbian trans commune that continued to host traveling artists and poets from around Latin America and sell feminist and anti-capitalist literature, as well as hold social gatherings for women and trans people in their networks. And I can talk more about that. It's a pretty cool place. Yeah, it's a pretty cool place. I can talk more about that later. But what I will say, though, is that among all of this activity, it's also worth noting that LGBT plus placemaking efforts, whether politically inflected or not, whether about mobilizing resources to sustain businesses or using the opportunity of the pandemic as a catalyst for, other political and social aims, it was all happening within this larger context where I, from my Zona Rosa apartment, could hear protests multiple times a week, every week. Whether workers were protesting the Hard Rock Cafe's wage theft in front of the US Embassy, or elderly folks were protesting through encampments outside the Instituto Mexicano de Seguro Social or Social Security office, right, asking for their pensions. Moves for economic justice were front and center with bodies taking up space. Which leads me to return to where this talk started, at the Glorieta de los Insurgentes, which became a site that explicitly called for the collective cooperation and appropriation of space by trans folks, lenchas, and maricas. This was a dissident marketplace in a circular plaza, right, with the key metro station that already has a history of queer and trans people hanging out, along with goths, punks, and emo kids. And so it's a place of that type of sociability, which is also aptly named, right? And I say aptly named because Glorieta de los Insurgentes is insurgents, right? It's the roundabout sort of Glorieta of the insurgents. And, the informal sellers and peddlers that were there, right, are part of this sort of larger informal economy, right? Informal sellers and peddlers are present everywhere in Ciudad de Mexico, just about, right? But this form of coming together as a collective is not necessarily as common. It's more distinct. And perhaps actually more common for the indigenous communities selling together that were nearby. They're the ones who set the precedent, right? In fact, the word we see written on this banner, tianguis, is not Spanish, but rather, like many Mexican words, a Spanicified word derived from the Nahuatl term Tiyansigitzli, which I may be pronouncing wrong. I think I probably am, so excuse me for that. But essentially means street or open air market. And most of the indigenous folks who were nearby, right, these queer and trans young people, not all of whom were young, but mostly young, were folks that were hailing from Oaxaca and doing similar types of things like selling crafts, right, that had become more about appealing to tourist sensibilities and survival, right, in terms of like that type of cultural production. Whereas the queer and trans and feminist assemblages, right, were more of individual sellers with their own sort of style, flair, commitments coming together under this collective organizing banner that was specifically political in solidarity with each other for economic and creative survival in community. And unlike something like a farmer's market, right, specifically in opposition to authorization. They weren't supposed to be there and they weren't necessarily going to last, right? Though, you know, the sort of, what's the word? The sort of temporary nature of these formations are temporary in the short term. They do keep on coming back, right? In different kinds of ways and in different places, right? But regardless, they were going to make it work for as long as they could, right? And they were there throughout the time that I was there and, you know, moving a little bit further into the fall. And then there's also new forms emerging in different kinds of spaces with the explicit intention of forwarding economic justice by pushing against the heteropatriarchal expressions of colonialism that affect our sexual possibilities, especially those of queer and trans women and non-binary folks. So for example, in the Condesa neighborhood of Mexico City, I attended a queer art show at a gallery that centered young women's multimedia visual art to explore this theme of feminine monsters or the monstrosity of femininity in various ways. And it was really cool, lots of really cool art pieces. But what I'm going to focus on is what was happening outside of that, that exhibition. Outside the show, in the patio area, were a bunch of vendors. Some were selling materials to raise political consciousness, some art, some bath soaps and oils. Others sold their designs on prints and underwear of each queer manifestation of the zodiac, for example, because we do like our astrology stereotype, of which I am located within. And one booth was selling a book of collected feminist fanzines from Mexico and Latin America from 2015 to 2020. It was really cool. I don't have it with me. It'd be great to share. It's in storage right now. But another booth that I really want to focus on included this creator of the Sales Violeta on the left-hand side, who in conjunction with other comrades was able to create their own line of dildos to serve the practical and aesthetic needs of gender and sexual minorities. This includes designing a harness for the dildos and employing a flight of women cyclists who delivered straight to the person who ordered discreetly to avoid different kinds of issues, right? Because people live in complicated situations, complicated housing situations. And, you know, all with an ethic of fair pay and prices as opposed to profit, which gave the opportunity to move away, right, from big brands. And there's a lot of sex shops, right, in the Zona Rosa and other kinds of places, right? And so it's actually really cool that, you know, one of these women was able to sort of make them on her own and experiment with them and the material and all of that kind of stuff, you know, and move away from these sort of heteronormative toys, right? Because if you look at some of them, they're different colors. It's hard to tell with the ones that are down there, but isn't that like the Saber Moon, like saber, right? The Sailor Moon saber, like in the bottom, right? So I mean, imagine getting like penetrated with a saber, like with the Sailor Moon saber, like, you know, it's cool. And there's this, there were these other kinds of designs too that were very much about like decentering the imagery of like the penis, right? Which is often more difficult to find in, you know, sex toy shops. Cool. And lastly for today, I'd like to mention this community dining room that opened over the summer called Manos Amigues, that gave you a full meal, drink, and a side for 15 pesos, which was very much a symbolic price because that's under $1, right? And it's a place that I would not have heard about if it weren't for an older trans woman who attended a lesbian cinema event at another primary field site that I don't touch on today, but is featured very prominently in my larger project, right? The bookstore and cultural center Somos Voces, mentioning that she and others affiliated with a recent elderly LGBT center that had to, close for a while, Vida Alegre, spent time here. So when I arrived, Alex, the Comedor's main organizer and visionary, was already deep in conversation with another person looking to learn more about the place. There were a few older folks individually eating at tables next to walls that flew colorful pieces of history. Banners commemorating pride marches and protests from decades ago. And these were original. I was actually shocked. I was like, what are these things doing here? Who gave this to you? But, the networks they're pretty close. There's a whole mess of us, right? But a lot of the people who are kind of responsible for these places and some of these more visible projects, a lot of them know each other and they're part of, smaller networks. But anyway, a young man, right, in one of these pictures on the left-hand side, and I'm making that assumption, was atop an elevated platform tinkering with turntables. So when I was there, I ate my meal, looked over at the kitchen where there was these older white men, and I'm calling them older white men in terms of like their positionality as most likely North Americans, so US people and perhaps also from Canada, right, serving as volunteers, washing dishes, while more local folks, right, like a señora who was actually employed there because there was a fleet of both employees and volunteers, was serving food. And then, the young trans woman who had collected my money at the door then comes over to see what's needed and what to help out with in the area where food was being prepared. So eventually Alex came over to chat enthusiastically about the space and the vision moving forward. This group of employees and volunteers intended not only to feed people, especially those in the LGBT plus community, but also to create another center for sexual and gender dissidence and joy through creative artistic expression, which they were beginning to show and take form when I was present. Cool. So to close this brief sampling of observations, right, these different moments throughout my field work and my revisit to these spaces, I'd like to say, right, that during pandemic times, there continued to be social movements for economic justice, some of which are explicitly linked to anti-capitalism and anti-colonial struggle, as well as a different logic of collectivity and a reinsistence of the need to come together to express ourselves and our bodies. Collective responsibility in a global pandemic has proven tricky, especially in terms of the inequality in access to vaccines and blatant and prevalent spread of misinformation. My work demonstrates that collective responsibility, however, is also economic justice, social care, collective enjoyment, and emotional and mental accompaniment. However, not all LGBT placemaking is concerned with disrupting oppressive structures or innovating in the face of disaster. Some of these adaptive efforts were simply about survival and/or about maintaining business as usual as much as would be possible within a pandemic context. And so before I end, I'm going to briefly show this visual again for Creative Destiny. As I mentioned earlier, discussing the literature on Black placemaking, linked fate has been a driving impetus behind creating place and community. For some, it's been a battle of survival, and for others, ways of practicing or attempting to approach beloved community. These concepts like creative destiny are about making place. Yet creative destiny is premised on choosing each other in the face of difference with varying relationships to marginalization and social positions, which I think is also particularly interesting to see through, LGBTQ, right, IA2S+, et cetera, populations, precisely because within population comparison shows the incredibly distinct and diverse, right, social positions across race and class and gender and everything else. And so the insistence to come together to choose, right, is something that I find to be really important to look into and interrogate further when we think about emancipatory futures and potentials. Linked fate might evolve in some way into creative destiny, or in other words, using these positions that you were born into or given, right, to then expand and purposely choose each other, right, outside of just strategic means. But creative destiny can also be the starting point. And again, the act of creation can be the destination in and of itself, but it can also be part of an iterative spiral toward beloved community. And there are different ways of defining beloved community. It's precisely that contestation that defines our placemaking processes and our strategies, and especially those that are more self-consciously politically inclined, what these emancipatory futures mean, what they look like. But one of the ways that I'm thinking about this is through bell hooks. And, I want to mention a quote from her book, Killing Rage, Ending Racism. She writes, "Beloved community is formed not by the eradication of difference, but by its affirmation, by each of us claiming the identities and cultural legacies that shape who we are and how we live in the world." And it's precisely that process of working toward beloved community with its trials, tribulations, failures, and successes, specifically for grounding possibilities of new social relations and governance structures based on social justice and wellness, that animates my research agenda moving forward even beyond this project. And is very much part of some of the collaborative work that I do, but also something that I would love and intend to explore more in my next major project, which I'll just briefly mention right now, which is where I'll be considering the interdisciplinary and embodied turn in social justice praxis. And so I envision studying groups and organizations whose psychosomatic theory of change connects dismantling global oppressive structures to relationship interventions within and between the self, others, and planet. That is, groups and organizations whose understanding of achieving social justice revolves around mind, body, and sometimes spirit, which I'm increasingly interested in just from a personal level. Practices that work towards healing globally inherited traumas, right, as an avenue towards dismantling global oppressive structures and therefore getting closer to our emancipatory futures. And I'm still determining which groups and cases to look into. Very open about that actually and being influenced to move in different directions. But currently I'm considering, for example, perhaps an all-women self-defense and consciousness raising group located in Mexico, a mostly US-based network of mind-body trauma thinker practitioners, and a socially engaged Buddhist center concerned with environmental well-being and very much beloved community. All right. So just want to say thanks again to CLAGS and everyone who made this talk possible with all the elements required in bringing me face-to-face with you all, as well as virtually present with everyone who's joining us on Zoom, which is like basically 30 people. So that's what's up. And of course, I'd like to just quickly, thank the funders for specifically the summer 2021 fieldwork that I did, which comes partially from the Social Science Research Council, the Division of Social Sciences at UCLA, and then a more broad thanks to everyone who actively supports me through this work and all the work that I do. And, last but not least, most importantly, the gender and sexual, either minorities or some would call themselves dissidents in Mexico who received me or shared space, stories, and dreams with me. Thank you. So where are we with time? Oh, okay, cool. Yeah.
You good for Q&A?
Yeah, let's go. Let's go hang out. Let me go sit.
Thank you so much, Christina. We have time for questions and answers now. So I will pass the microphone to audience questions, but maybe I will start with one. And actually, I need to change the camera so that everybody at home, hold on just 1 second. This is going to be slower than you want it to be. There we go. Okay. Christina, one of the things, that was a great talk. One of the things I was very impressed with was that you came up with your own definition of placemaking. And you gave it early on in one of the slides. And there were a couple interesting pieces, and then it went by. Could you just take us through the definition of placemaking and how you created that definition?
Hello. So, I'm trained as a sociologist, right? And so the reason that I felt the need to kind of think about placemaking in a different way was to very sort of consciously think about it sociologically. Not that existing definitions don't do that. And obviously the people who already use this term all the time, right? Geographers, urban planners, all of these other people. It's a term that is just, it's in everything. It's taken for granted as a thing that you do. But what I was noticing, at least when I was looking at the term being used in other disciplines or interdisciplinary work of that kind, was that it wasn't necessarily broad enough to encompass like what I wanted to encompass. I really wanted to think about placemaking as something that's done physically to the built environment, but also done culturally, symbolically. Like, what are all of the things that go into, making a place? And while people like critical geographers would take the contestation of power and resources and all these things as like a duh, and perhaps even urban planners who are like really thinking about it more of like, oh yeah, I just didn't see all of that stuff come together. And so even the definition that I put up here, and when I say come together, I mean like, as in like, define your terms type of come together, right? Like, I think it's just coming from a place of being trained as a sociologist and wanting to be like, I'm using this word. I want it to encompass all of these things that I see are already doing that, but I just want to put the language to it, And so the way that I describe it or frame it in my sociology compass piece is a little bit more convoluted, I think, than what I end up putting here. But I think that it's like very compatible with how plenty of people are already using it. It's just that sometimes it's used to think about more sort of on purpose collaboration, or sometimes it's used to think about specifically grassroots or community type of things. And I really wanted to think about it as like all of us. It's the implicit, tacit cooperation, right, of all of the actors that are involved under these different constraints, right? And so that's kind of how I was thinking about it. I mean, if it's useful for people, cool. If not, use the definitions or the ways that are talked about in the people who use the term first. But I think I was really trying to kind of put together a working definition for sociologists, especially sociologists who do work in place and space, but are not using the term, right? And yeah, I mean, and like, we have careers. It's I'm trying to get a job. Like, if somebody's going to give me a job, I got to write papers and articles, and part of what we do are create terms and concepts, right? So just full transparency. It's a bit of I'm trying to do the thing, but it's also a bit of this is kind of what we do is either create new terms or words or breathe in sort of extensions to ones that exist.
I should say that this event today is part of a series at CLAGS called the Queer Class Relations series, and it fits so perfectly. I think the event fits perfectly within that series. One of the things that you mentioned is that while you were there were looking at graffiti, going to restaurants, bars, clubs, pop-ups. There were protests. And you said that the movements for economic justice were at the fore, or was a through line for many of those protests. And you also mentioned that you're very eager to see a more global comparative sociology come into being, or be imagined. Do you think that global comparative sociology will proceed along the lines of class? Is that going to be, I'm asking you to guess. Is that going to be one of the most important bases for comparisons across the globe?
Um, that's an interesting question. I wasn't really thinking about it that way. I guess what initially comes to my mind is, a lot of the work, for example, that right colleagues in the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics do, right, which is already about thinking globally, thinking about, right, these processes of capitalism, of, settler, coloniality, and all of these different things, looking at their particular places and cases and movements within a larger conversation. And so I think that there's ways that this is already happening. And I think it's not that it's not happening in sociology, but sometimes part of that gets regulated to a subfield, right? And so like there's like the global and transnational sociologists, right? And a lot of times there's ways that we're talking about the relationships between people and institutions and other relevant factors that aren't always like nicely emplaced, right? Which the exception can sometimes be those who are really adamant about historical context in their work, or really adamant about, shining the light ethnographically into space and in place. But I guess where I was going with that is to think about how do we shift the discipline more broadly in ways that I can already see happening in other disciplines and other disciplinary areas. And the way that I see that happening is thinking about, I guess I would need some clarification on what you mean by class, because they're thinking about things that like influence class, right? And so some of sort of the global urban studies literature are thinking about like neoliberalism, right? Or gentrification and what that means. Or, there are particular Marxist brands of what's going on. And so, thinking about class in a sort of abstracted way is something that's very common in this kind of work. But I think that there's also ways, and please let me know if I'm like misunderstanding the question, right? That we can think about it more empirically on the ground, because, class as like a category of analysis is already what sociologists do, right? Or as like one of many sociodemographic variables, right? And so, one can argue that like that stuff's already happening. So since that's what sociology is, of course, any type of this work is going to incorporate that. But what I'm interested in seeing more of is very much tying right outside of the sort of variable and kind of category stuff, right? Tying into these larger processes, right? So that like you inevitably, invariably have to talk about things like that if you're talking about, capitalism, even, racial colonial capitalism, like whatever sort of iteration of the terminology best suits how you're thinking about it. But, even for me, it's a little complicated because the way that I think you can do it and the way that I have to do it through Mexico is to see class in an embodied and like spatialized way, right? Because even in the survey that I put out with the help of my lovely, beautiful partner, Araceli Alfaro, we couldn't really grasp, right, class, right, in the way that we're used to doing surveys in the US, right? I couldn't, it's more difficult to kind of get at that with Mexicans. I'm sure that there's particular ways that happen with like the national surveys and census that I'm just not able to sort of do, right, from my position. But even sort of getting to ask people about, what they do for a living or what sector they're involved in, or even their like level of education does not correspond neatly to class, because so many people are part of the informal labor market, which isn't just about settlers and, peddlers on the street, right? But also like, are you renting something, selling something, providing a service on the side that has nothing to do necessarily with like formal labor, right? Or you could be highly educated, which a lot of people that I was in relationship with were, and yet they don't have any money, or someone doesn't really have a job and yet they're good because they have their house, and they have their house because that's property that's been in their family. And that person is not necessarily like a light-skinned person, right? That's actually the Mixteco person who like, lives in the south of the city. So there's just a lot of complexity there. And so when I get at it, it's specifically in these sort of political inflected ways, or looking at space, or how much does something cost? What's the aesthetic? Like, what kind of things are people doing for work, right? Like, what's possible in terms of where your projects can be? And, are you in the periphery or not, right? There's this one place that was really, really cool, right? This like shelter created by a formerly incarcerated trans activist, right? For other trans people, mostly women, but not just, that I visited. And also was the recipient of like money from like the survey. We did like direct kind of like redistribution of resources. And I say we, I mean my partner and I, which was a choice because I don't got money like that. But we did it. And, that's located on like the outskirts of the city, right? And so even if it was a place, even though it's a place that has government support and was like allocated a space for that, right? So those are sort of the ways that I get to class, I think, more clearly. I think that there are other scholars who do that. Am I invested in that being the way? Probably, because I'm invested in things being done increasingly relationally and less in terms of categories, right? So yeah. So was that how you were?
Thank you so much.
Okay, cool.
I hope we get to talk about the word choose before we go, but do you have questions from online? Okay, so we have online questions. We'll take one online question if you can read it, Laura, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So what were you interested in and what do you want to know more about?
Okay, I'm gonna cheat a little. We have 2 online questions. One maybe is a very quick answer. How would you say placemaking in Spanish?
Oh, I don't know. No, someone tell me. I don't.
All right.
I mean, other than like construyendo espacio, haciendo espacio. Like, it's not, like there's longer sort of phrases for things that are not terms. Yeah. And let me know if there's like a term that like scholars in Latin America are using more, but yeah, please disabuse me of my ignorance, because I write in English for the most part. So
Thank you.
yeah.
All right, second question. Excellent talk. I was struck by the concept of being on safari that you mentioned. Can you talk more about that? I'm curious about the multiple objectives: escape, refueling, strategy, community, of placemaking, and wondering what you observed in your study.
Sure. So the being on safari thing is something that Jason Orrin talks about in Boys Town. Other scholars talk about it too, even if they don't term it that way. And I mean, essentially, it's just in reference to like straight people, especially straight women who are hanging out at gay bars and queer spaces, and like to sort of like, have a good time. And I think that to just go a little extra, I think that whether it's self-consciously discussed or not, there are through lines and a lineage that harkens back to this idea of like, roughing it, right? Of all kinds, that doesn't have to do with necessarily being part of the, gender and sexual, others, minorities, whatever, but is also something that's been talked about in terms of like, like space along race lines, right? And so it's just, a way to talk about how people for whom a space or place is not constructed for come and are chilling and are not necessarily invested in that space or place, the function of that space or place, or even promoting the sensibility of that. So it's not everyone. I mean, Jason Orrin talks about, this like woman in this back room, right, who was, having sex with some dude, right? So heterosexual sex, who like was not imposing themselves, like it wasn't sort of changing the dynamic of the space. And this really is really important. And what comes to mind, like specifically, especially for, gay and queer, bi men, is the way that a lot of cruising spaces have been impacted over the decades by needing to be open to everyone, and people who are not socialized into those sorts of sexual sensibilities get really offended and then end up calling the cops, or something happens where that place gets shut down. And it's just like, you weren't supposed to be there in the first place. And that gets part of a larger conversation of, well, why is it that, you know, there was this huge sort of move of, right, these straight women into these spaces? Well, we know it's because of a lack of a sense of security and an inability to sort of organize among themselves for like the right to the city or the right to a good time, right, without, you know, violence, right? And then what happens after that is that the straight dudes start coming after them because they're there. And now all of us are hanging out together, which is great, but like, I could have done that with you somewhere else, you know? And so it's also somewhat controversial because there are people's visions for how we come together that are very mixed in. There's other visions that are like a little bit more separatist. There's some visions that are a little combination of the two, but I understand, right, where that's coming from, of like the consequences of people being in places, shifting those dynamics who are not really supposed to be there, right? And then the second part of the question, I lost the plot.
Yeah, I'm curious about the multiple objectives of placemaking and wondering what you observed in your study.
Yeah, so that's part of the reason why, yeah, I mean, it's everything and anything. That's part of the reason why I felt like we needed to sort of think about a definition that was more encompassing, because a lot of the ways that it's often talked about is in a very sort of critical kind of response resistance kind of way to it, right? As like the alternative to what already exists. But I wanted it to be expanded because there are so many different actors and people that come into projects being made or places being created, and some of them are very institutionalized, right, or commemorative, and some are super ephemeral. And we know as queer and trans people that ephemerality is part and parcel of what we do, right? Whether we want it to be that, sometimes it's on purpose, sometimes it's not on purpose, right? But so yeah, so I mean, it's whatever the vision is, right? It's what we're doing when we sort of come together, not necessarily in agreement, but we're kind of making shit happen and doing it within particular constraints, right? Always, right? And trying to push against those constraints in various ways. So yeah, it's just like the more kind of general thing. Yeah.
Great, audience. Yes.
With the question about placemaking in Spanish, it just kind of made me curious about how you presented yourself to your interlocutors and how you presented your research. Because if you weren't using or trying to translate the word placemaking, what exactly were you making clear to people you were in conversation with, or observing and participating with, as to why you were there, what you were interested in, what your goal was in that space, especially like when it comes to making an entry in a space as an outsider sometimes in some ways. So how you went about that in your research?
Yeah, for sure. So I am not a wallflower ethnographer. Like I don't have the temperament to do that, let alone the sort of like, you know, politics or ability kind of thing. And so like, you know, with a lot of the people that I was hanging out with more, like more regularly, or sort of I would call like the protagonist organizations or spaces of this place, right? Like they knew exactly who I was. Like I was this doctoral candidate from UCLA coming and hanging out, you know, and also of my background, right? So, you know, sometimes I kind of think of myself as a Chicana, sometimes I don't, kind of thing, right? But always a Latina. Like my parents were in Mexico and El Salvador, and now I have Mexican papers, which is weird, and I got it through my mom. And you know, that wasn't something that needed to happen for me to be there, but it was something that like, you know, my mom wanted to make happen at some point for both my brother and I. And then when it became clear that I was getting, you know, some positive feedback and some, and I felt like intuitively that there was something here that I could do, then I was like, okay, mom, like, let's make this happen. And she's the one who makes those things happen, right? With the Mexican consulate and all of that. She's a mover and shaker. She's a hustler. So, And so that's what ended up happening with that. In terms of sort of open public space where just like everyone is going to be in, I'm a patron at a bar just like anyone else kind of thing. Like I'm just there, right? But anyone that I was like specifically having an extended amount of time in their organization or anyone that I interviewed, right? They knew exactly who I was, like where I was coming from, all those sorts of things. And even in my oral histories, I try to keep a lot of space. Like I don't do semi-structured interviews. I do oral history. So they're very open. They're very much about giving space for people to start with their birth, talk about their life stories. And I did that very purposefully with the intention, and I got form signed and all of that, of taking those and giving them to like an archive in Mexico so that they're like there as part of community history and accessible to other people. And so, yeah, I mean, yeah, when it made sense for me to talk about stuff, I talked about stuff. Sometimes things about myself would come out even if I wasn't that conscious about it, right? Because that's just who I am. I'm a pretty open, transparent person. And in terms of like, you know, how I talked about my research or presented it, you know, it was very clear that I was talking about like people's place projects, right? It's just the word placemaking wasn't something that was coming out. And sometimes I did say it in English, right? Because again, some of the people that I was working with are fairly educated people. So I also want to make clear, like, this is not a project that focuses on the most marginal expressions, right? Of like gender and sexual dissonance slash like sexual like no, that wouldn't have been appropriate for me to do. I wouldn't have had access to be in those spaces in terms of my safety, my bodily integrity, in terms of sticking out. And so, you know, there are some places that I go that would be considered like more marginal in terms of race and class. But for the most part, I keep it in the sort of kinds of places and people who self-consciously describe themselves as like, you know, either gay, thinking about transnational identity, or right, these particular terms of lencha, marica, trans, you know, whatever. And I'm not quite sure if I heard this in your question, but I want to say it because I feel like it would matter to you. My way of sort of interacting and giving back was very was very like org and like situation specific, right? So for example, one of the organizations that I was following most closely was Archivos y Memorias Diversas, right? And, you know, I helped them like run their historical seminar 2 years in a row, right? Like, I also gave presentations to the taller that they run, right? The workshop slash presentational space that they run on Tuesdays. And that was specifically on the survey stuff that I did because that was the most relevant, right? In terms of like Casa de las Muñecas, right? This place that was on the periphery. I gave them money. Like I literally told people who took the survey, I was like, for every participant who takes this survey, but like for real takes it, not half, you know, ass takes it, because it ended up yielding an 80% completion rate, which is what you want, right? And it was an N of like, or total number of 367, right? I was like, for every person who does this, like my partner and I are giving $1 to this org, right? So I also wanted to sort of keep these different kinds of things open. I mean, for other stuff, I was present and, you know, there's just different things. And then there are some groups for whom I didn't do very much, right? I had less strong ties and relationships with them. I'm open to that. I haven't had as much communication with some folks as I wanted to, just because I've been really caught up in like trying to live here and write and get a job and figure things out. And so I need to circle back. But yeah, it was just very contingent. And, you know, I'm still in the process of figuring out how I can do this the best that I can when I'm working not just with one org and sort of doing a lot of the traditional, like, I'm gonna, you know, be an organizer for you, or I'm gonna do service provision for you, or I'm gonna help you with administrative tasks. The truth is, I've done a little bit of a lot of kinds of things based off of the relationships that were established and what seemed like to me was the thing to go about it, but it's not super coherent. And how I think about doing that in terms of ethics moving forward, I'm very open to what that can look like, but also cautious because sometimes when you're really beholden to certain relationships, people want you to talk about things in a certain way. And I feel like I need to be true to my positionality as like a thinker and scholar and person who's trying my best to sift through these things and tell the truth as I see it, which can get extra complicated when you're using real names, which I don't for everybody. Like there were some people that they use synonyms and sites that like I don't because they told me. They're like, no. And I was like, okay, great. So I'm not going to. So that's kind of how I navigate that terrain. Mhm.
We are in a situation where we have a lot more questions and no more time. And before we thank Christina, I want to thank our interpreters who were with us today. I want to thank our CLAGS board co-chair, Laura Westengard, for being here with us today and helping out with the Q&A. And Christina, I know people are going to want to get in touch with you because they do have questions. So if you could quickly tell us an email that is good for you.
Yeah. I for things like this, like I generally say my UCLA one, so it's cchica24@ucla.edu. Yeah. Thank you. I'm very long-winded. I feel like I could have taken more questions if I wasn't like, you know.
This was terrific. And so now we're going to thank you. I want to thank you for a great talk today, for this amazing work that you're doing, and for bringing it to us and for bringing it to CLAGS and to our audience today. Again, everybody, this recording will be on our YouTube channel if you want to share it or teach it. Christina, thank you so much.
Thank you all. Especially all y'all who are here in person, MVPs.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah. All right.